saying that without Nexon's authorization, disclosing to a third party the company's trade secrets or any information acquired during the course of their employment. The employment agreement also includes a 1-year non-compete clause that prevents employees from working in the same line of business that could potentially infringe on Nexon's trade secrets without Nexon's prior consent. Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Onepeg. So we have an official court filing. Nexon has officially sued Iron Mace Games in the state of Washington, specifically Seattle, Washington, as it relates to Dark and Darker. They also went so far as to specifically name Joo-Hoon Choi, otherwise known as SDF, and Terry Park, CEO of Iron Mace Games. The filing, the official court filing, is something that can be found as part of the United States electronic filing system when it comes to court dockets and cases and all of that stuff. If you look it up, you have to use what is called the United States Pacer system. It costs 10 cents per page, and I paid for all of the documents. As it turns out, I found out some things that I think are incredibly important to know, because there is way more light shown on this claim that Nexon is making than what we've been led to believe thus far. Paints a more interesting timeline in terms of what they are claiming. And again, I say claiming because this has yet to be proven in any way. It's literally just Nexon's complaint. Offers some insight into some things I wasn't even aware of. Like, did you guys know that Terry has a home in California and is a United States citizen? Because I didn't. If this thing goes to trial, I might actually have to appear in court. And I'm not kidding, because it names me and my channel in the lawsuit. Neat. Anyway, yesterday, April 14th, 2023, the plaintiff, Nexon Korea Corporation, filed a claim for misappropriation of trade secrets under the United States DTSA in the United States, as well as infringement of copyright under the United States copyright laws. They named not only Iron Mace, but also SDF, otherwise known as Joo-Hoon Choi, and Terry Park, CEO of Iron Mace Games, individually, and are seeking judgments against not just Iron Mace, but both of the other individuals each. Now, this 55-page document is the main summary of what they are claiming, their preliminary statement, and most of the covering evidence that they plan on showing if this goes to trial. Part of that evidence includes the interviews that they did with me, with Pestily, and with Jonah Vale over the course of the different phases of their playtests. Now, in their preliminary statement, they say that they seek injunctive relief and damages arising from the defendant's theft of Nexon's video game developed as a part of project called P3, which we are familiar with in other videos that I've done. If you haven't seen those, please go back and check them out. There's some interesting pieces of information there. The short and long of it is that Nexon is claiming that their P3 project, further known as P3 from here on out inside of this document, was full of trade secrets that both Mr. Choi and Terry Park stole from them upon their exodus from Nexon, of which Mr. Choi was fired from his role after, I guess, stealing stuff from Nexon. At least that's what Nexon claims. They are seeking not only restitution, being a cease and desist of the builds of Dark and Darker moving forward, but also monetary damages from lost profits that Nexon is claiming that it lost due to the over $840,000 of research and development money that it stuffed into the development of Project P3, only then to have it canceled. Now, they are saying that they developed P3 from August 2020 to July 2021, and that both defendant Choi, SDF, as well as Terry Park were both involved in the P3 project, overseeing the development of Project P3 in directorial roles, and then left. They are saying that not only did they steal source code, they are actually saying that source code was stolen, but also audio-visual source code, and show examples therein inside of this 55-page document. Not only do they say that, but they also go even further to say that the defendants, in their haste, made the same game. Condoning the defendant's conduct, meaning allowing this to continue, would threaten Nexon, the video game industry, and all of the consumers who enjoy playing sophisticated video games. That's a nice way to put it. We're sophisticated gamers. And then they go in and talk about how P3 was being developed, as well as the process. They talk about jurisdiction and venue that say that this is a violation of the DTSA, the Defend Trade Secrets Act, as well as the United States Copyright Act. And later on in the document, the reason why they are saying this is because they believe that the United States was being heavily marketed to and is the largest market share of all of the people that have played the game. Now, here is the section that is in regard to Nexon's, what they refer to as their factual background. This is a background that tells the story of the process to develop Project P3 and how they believe that their Project P3 information and its process procedures were stolen from them. They talk about, in order to protect its proprietary information, Nexon maintains written company policies and guidelines that govern the protection of company data. And then they list all of the different security guidelines that they have people attest to as employees and reattest to on an annual basis. They also talk about how employees aren't able to work on things like this from home unless they use specific Nexon sources. And again, this is something that they require in writing that all of the employees sign an attestation to. And they are named here as limiting employees' information, prohibiting employees from disclosing trade secrets, forbids employees from reproducing protected material, and prohibits employees from falsifying or damaging company information. Saying that without Nexon's authorization, disclosing to a third party the company's trade secrets or any information acquired during the course of their employment, the employment agreement also includes a 1-year non-compete clause that prevents employees from working in the same line of business that could potentially infringe on Nexon's trade secrets without Nexon's prior consent. One of the largest question marks that we have been left with was whether or not there was a non-compete agreement. According to Nexon, both Terry Park and Mr. Choi signed non-competes. They then go on to talk about how there is a multi-step process, including OTPs and multi-factor authentication procedures, as well as username and passwords that have to be recycled every 120 days, changed. All of this stuff is logged. They then talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, saying that people involved with COVID also were given special provisions, but that there was a process and procedure set in place by Nexon for people to work from home during COVID. They talk about hiring dates on when they hired Defendant Choi and Defendant Park and when the documents were signed, the dates in which the defendants agreed to and signed each of the agreements. However, one of the things that's interesting here is that Defendant Choi signed the employment agreement on January 1st of 2021. At this point in time, he had already been taking files and putting them on a personal server with permission through January 1st of 2021. And at this point, he had not yet been told that that was something that he wasn't allowed to do. Secondarily, the data protection agreement that was signed by Terry Park wasn't signed until August 5th of 2021, after Defendant Choi had already been terminated from his position, and Terry ended up leaving his position only 4 days later. That's interesting to me. Now, they go on to talk about the stages of game development, and this is actually an important piece, believe it or not, where they say that there is a pitch made by somebody at the company, prototyping of the game, pre-production, production, post-production, and then launch. Now, between what they talk about is here, between the pitching stage and brainstorming is basically pitching. Once the prototyping stage begins, so you have pitching and prototyping, and at the end of the prototyping stage, they give a playable prototype to the higher-ups. And then the playable prototype that gets played by the higher-ups gets greenlit or not. Is the game fun? The concept that you have for the game, is the game fun? If yes, they say, okay, work on this some more, and then show us what you got. If that prototyping stage is greenlit, they then go through what is called pre-production. And according to Nexon, this pre-production stage usually takes 6 months to a year. If the game passes the tests and the management approves the game, that production stage then takes over. So you get to pre-production, they play it again, and then they tell you whether or not you can go into full-blown production of the game or not for something that gets ready to be marketed, and then they start creating business plans. This is where you start seeing alpha tests, beta tests, focus groups, those kinds of things. From there, they have an in-house alpha test, a public beta, something along those lines. That's kind of like toward the final stages of production. And then eventually you get a launch with all of the monetization features that Nexon is notorious for. According to Nexon, Project P3 made it through the pitching and prototyping stage and was well through the pre-production phase over the course of the 11 months of this development cycle. And during that period of time, they say that they invested $841,000 US worth of Korean won into the P3 project. Now, they then say that they created a whole bunch of proprietary information, source code-wise and whatnot, that then Mr. Choi stole while working on that P3 project. But there's an interesting admission here that they had prior not admitted to. On August 30th, Choi requested permission from Nexon's Deputy Division Manager of New Development, who is also in charge of IT security, to export P3 source code outside of Nexon to his private server. Choi stated that exporting the source code was necessary to maximize efficiency while his team worked remotely during the pandemic. He was approved, and from August 2020 to January 2021, Choi installed a Git server on his external server to access the exported P3 source code. Because storing minimal amounts of source code presented a low risk, the new development manager granted Choi temporary approval to export P3 source code for the purpose of testing the program. They also state that the new development manager did not grant permission to Choi to export build files to an external server. So there's a difference between P3 source code and actual build files. Build files would be like the actual things that the architecture is made out of, not just source code. However, it's very likely, and again, not that I'm trying to play devil's advocate, but it's very likely that Mr. Choi just took it as, yes, you can do certain things, but didn't realize that the other certain things were things that he wasn't able to do. And he was only moving things around in order to be able to make sure that he could do his job. But I digress. The most interesting part of this section is this blurb here. By February 2021, the P3 project was past the early prototyping stage. Therefore, Choi knew or should have known that the new development manager's temporary approval was no longer valid. In apparent recognition that his export of P3 source code was unauthorized, on February 18th, 2021, over a month after Choi set up the mirroring to his external server to export source code, Choi again requested authorization from Nexon's new development manager to export that source code. In their original statement, they had said that this was something that he was told that he had to stop at a certain point in time and then decided not to. But this wasn't something that he was ever told to discontinue and then could like restart up at a later point in time. He took it upon himself to make the request again to make sure that this was still okay, and this new development manager rejected his request. When making his request, Choi did not inform the new development manager that he had already mirrored the Git to his external server to export P3 source code as well as transferring P3 build files. To minimize his conduct, Choi has disassembled in public statements that the use of his private servers was necessary to develop P3 during the period when COVID-19 prevented employees from working in Nexon's offices. But no such private servers were necessary because Choi, like other Nexon employees, had access to cloud resources through Nexon's arrangement with OneDrive and AWS that would have remedied any issues of connecting to the company server while working remotely. Furthermore, of the 20 separate downloads of stolen P3 source code and art resources to Choi's server located in Shoshan, 18 downloads occurred after Nexon lifted its COVID-19 work from home policy on June of 2021. Basically saying that them claiming that they were working remotely from home due to COVID is a bunch of BS. They then say that Choi plotted to steal P3 for himself, saying that at the same time that they were transferring Nexon's P3 data to his private servers without authorization, they were soliciting P3 project team members to leave Nexon, according to an internal audit team, saying that he began approaching certain P3 team members in April of 2021 and spoke with each of them individually in June of 2021 to urge them to leave Nexon with him to recreate a similar game outside of Nexon. To persuade P3 members to leave Nexon, Choi lied to them by telling them that Nexon had no intent to release P3 when Nexon had, in fact, approved of moving forward with P3. Choi further explained to P3 project members that because they had created the game once before, they would be able to complete and release the game within 1 or 1.5 years. Now, this is something that we kind of have heard before, but according to one of P3's prior team members, one of their own team members that is still employed at Nexon, according to them, he had been informed by people at Nexon that this was done, that the game had been canceled. It could be that Mr. Choi was the person doing that informing, and maybe they were still under the impression that the game had been canceled. But this is something that Nexon is saying that is a little bit different from what we've been hearing. So there is a little bit of a conflicting report here. They're also saying that Mr. Choi was still transferring files outside of the April cutoff point, Remember, he had said that they had turned off their servers, the personal servers, back in April. In between April and July, there wasn't any file transfers going on. But Nexon now alleges that even as early as late to mid-June of 2021, not July, but mid-June of 2021, there were still files being moved back and forth to his house. So someone on the P3 team told the higher-ups at Nexon that they were being recruited to leave and make P3 outside of Nexon. Then Nexon conducted an internal audit and found stolen files. Nexon also requested access to Choi's servers so that Nexon could assess whether the stolen information had been disclosed in any third parties and what steps Nexon needed to take to prevent further damage. They then say that Choi basically destroyed evidence to prevent Nexon from realizing how far this went. They said that Choi originally signed a written forensic agreement to turn over their servers, which I assume they have documents to back up, and then Choi quickly changed his mind and refused. Instead, according to Choi, he instructed an acquaintance to permanently delete the files on his personal servers. And according to Choi, the server was wiped multiple times so that the data could not be recovered. According to Nexon, what they then believe is the reason why he did this was because then there would be no trail in terms of whether or not he transferred those files anywhere else. So while he may have wiped his own personal servers of any and all of that related data, to say that, okay, well, I don't have the data anymore and I've wiped this several times, so not even I can recover it. Now there's no electronic trail of any kind to follow to be able to prove that he hasn't sent that off and been using it in other places. They say that Choi's admission that he willfully spoliated evidence raises an inference that his private servers contained evidence that he misappropriated and continues to misappropriate Nexon's trade secrets. Now I think that that's maybe a bit of a reach. That's something that they're going to have to be able to prove actually happened, which means that at some point Iron Mace will likely have to turn over all of their source code and allow a direct comparison to be done, which is something that in the press, Nexon states Iron Mace is unwilling to do, but Iron Mace states in the press that they are. So we'll see. Actually, in this documentation later on down the line, Nexon actually says that they're willing to look at the source code, requested the source code from Iron Mace, but ironically, Iron Mace says that it's a trade secret. So we'll see if that's actually true or not. Now remember, Nexon went through this entire portion of where there's a game pitched and prototyped and pre-production, post-production, and then eventually full-on development, and then it gets released to the public as a final. But what they're saying is that because of them stealing the trade secrets that they've stolen, that Iron Mace didn't have to go through a huge portion of that beginning stuff. Defendants simply misappropriated Nexon's trade secrets to skip over those stages. Now, I will say that with a grain of salt, I believe that this is a little bit spurious. To me, it looks like if you have a team of 10 people that can sit around a table and all make quick decisions, because that's what indie games are kind of notorious for doing, small teams that can all sit in the same room and say, yeah, let's do that. No, let's not do that. Yes, let's do this. And that is the decision-making hub of the entire game. That's a lot easier than trying to find appointments with higher-ups that are going to make decisions and have to worry about budgetary constraints and all of these other pieces and parts that move around, because Nexon is a very large $30 billion corporate entity. Now, granted, they all have targets and stuff that they need to make, but there's still people to answer to, and the wheels in larger companies like that move an awful lot more slowly. I don't see something like this as being the gotcha moment that Nexon believes it to be. But again, they're trying to make an argument that sounds as amazing as they possibly can make it sound. The majority of video games fail before they get past a prototyping stage. When a game fails at the end of a prototyping stage, every hour of human effort and every dollar investment in the game is a loss. But the defendants didn't need to take that risk because it was already greenlit by Nexon, and the defendants knew that Nexon had already tested a game through prototyping and determined it was likely to be a commercial success, something which was unknown to anyone other than Nexon's employees. So what they're trying to say is that Nexon, being the determining factor as to whether or not the audience at large would find it to be something they wanted to play, because we've never seen Nexon release a final copy of a game that ended up falling on its face before, right? In the case of something like this, they're saying that because Nexon approved it for greenlight, naturally it's going to be a commercial success, so therefore X, Y, and Z. I don't necessarily believe that piece of it either. I think that's reaching, but there are a couple of pieces in here that are pretty bad. They then talk about through the 11,000 files, there's a whole bunch of stuff that gave them a significant advantage. And then they have a non-exhaustive list of examples that can be illustrative in this, this process. Now, they're talking about image files and whatnot that had been removed from Nexon's servers, that had been copied from Nexon's servers and moved over to Mr. Choi's private servers. They know what had been taken from them, But again, they don't know what Mr. Choi kept, if anything. These UI compass related files are important because they provide the cardinal direction for navigation and orientation purposes in P3 and Dark and Darker. They're basically saying the compass rows assets that are being used to determine where you are on the minimap and what direction you're facing is important information that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to derive or create on their own in as quick of an amount of time as they did. One other thing that I find a little bit weird here is that they're also saying that visual data was most time-consuming and labor-intensive. Each level took weeks or months to create. The visual data for Dark and Darker levels corresponds closely to the visual data for P3. And by what I believe this to mean is like the way that the walls are constructed and some of the architecture, which again is off-the-shelf stuff from the Unreal Store. So this to me doesn't hold as much water. And there is a little bit of a ridiculous piece here talking about lighting alone costing months of work. P3 has a unique yellow-orange lighting with a warm tone ambience that is unique for video games within P3's genre. Nexon spent months testing the temperature, saturation, brightness, and shadows, requiring much trial and error before getting the right look. I don't necessarily believe just because it's going to bog down the corporate entity of Nexon to determine what kind of white glow or orange glow or blue glow or whatever kind of glow color that this game needed was going to be something that Nexon needed to pass judgment on. Although, given that, it's not surprising that Dark and Darker tried to test out a color of blue light for their dungeon instead of using something yellow. But they do talk about movement character files, meaning the way that the characters are rigged and how they're animated when they walk around, swing swords, that kind of stuff. The appearance and movement of the 6-player controlled characters. These files took significant time, money, and effort to develop because they contain detailed numerical information on character movement and environmental changes according to game conditions. Now that could easily be written up to Unreal assets, and a lot of these Unreal assets off the shelf end up having character rigging, and all you're doing is setting animation paths. It's very possible that these animation paths could have even been hand-drawn and are roughly ending up being translated as a result of somebody just going, okay, well, let's have it traced this way, and then fine-tuning that tracing. Whether or not they are exactly the same or even similar enough in actual animation for weapon swings and walking gait and those kinds of things is unknown as of yet. But it'll be interesting to see once this comes out in court, if it actually comes out in court, whether or not this is actually true. Now, one of the things that they are saying here is that there is a complete build of the actual game that Mr. Choi ended up exploiting at some later point, with a P3 game exe was exported to his private server 108 separate times, meaning he had a playable demo of the game, 108 iterations of a playable demo of the game exported to his personal server. Again, completely wiped, and we have no evidence of it actually leaving that server and being used at Iron Mace at any level, but again, I digress. They then go in and talk about the artwork, which is stuff that we've seen before, but they talk about identical facial expressions for the Barbarian, the rucksack and pockets, but also showing Wizards of the West Coast, Wizards of the Coast, the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, showing their own concept art and how it is drastically different from the concept art of Dark and Darker with the Viking nature. Now, according to the concept artist for Dark and Darker, he says that the reason why they look like this is because of the off-the-shelf asset packs that were purchased from the Unreal Store are being used to build the concept art for the game. The drawings were reminiscent of the packages of armor and whatnot that they were purchasing off of the Unreal Store to be used in the game. And again, Nexon's argument in this case is there is an overwhelming abundance of different asset styles and types that you could have made this game from, but you decided to make it with the exact same ones that we had made our P3 game with, and that doesn't make sense and seems too similar. And they're showing the cleric and how the cleric concept art for Wizards of the Coast is different, and then the fighter for P3 versus Dark and Darker and the similarities. Some of these I think are a bit reaching, like the wizard baggy pouch to store loot. Where else would you put loot? A thick spellbook hanging at their waist to reflect wizard's tendency to reach for a spellbook, as well as threadbare black-gray robes and a wooden staff with a crystal ball at the center. And then they go and they try to show what the Wizard of the Coast wizard looks like. You're talking about different concept art and concept artists, and this, to me, literally just looks like Gandalf. Dark and Darker Rogue, they're saying, is substantially similar to the Thief. This, I actually think, is like their worst argument in terms of concept art, because these two look drastically different, although they are considered still rogues or thieves. And the Wizards of the Coast one is a drow elf, which doesn't really show me anything different. They could have just made this like a human skin, and it would be really, really close or similar to either one of these. And the same thing with the Ranger. I mean, how else would you make a Ranger look? I mean, this is just a really flashy looking ranger, but in the case of a game that's supposed to be dark and more gritty, like how Dark and Darker is styled, walking around in turquoise, they would obviously be drafted or dressed in a garb that would be more conducive to their surrounding areas, right? I'm not trying to pick apart the entire argument. I'm just kind of saying like, all right, well, here's an argumentative point. Many other types of assets can be purchased in addition to 3D models of characters. Other assets include items such as torches and treasure chests, non-player characters like monsters, assets to establish settings such as doors and castle walls, and animations such as hand movements to wield a sword. There's a vast selection of assets. Nexon was required to use creativity to select the assets that best expressed the ideas for P3. Defendants copied this creative selection. From here, there's some added information, stuff that we haven't seen before. In P3 and Darker, both feature a same fleshy, bald zombie with eyes that light up. Now, in this case, there is a difference in how these two are animated, because the zombie in Dark and Darker doesn't really ever flail its arms out unless it's ready to strike, but it does also have this gas cloud in P3. That is a little interesting. Again, pretty similar. In P3 and Darker, they contain a skeleton wizard that's hooded and carries a wooden staff. You can see that in both cases, it seems as though they are the same character model. If it's the same asset pack, that doesn't seem very strikingly different. Likewise, both games contain identical monsters, including the Mimic Chest, Wraith, and Cave Troll. So in this case, they have P3 game monster asset list. In here, they have Mimic's Chest, Gold, and Gem, Concept, Fake Treasure Chest, and they actually call it a Mimic. And you can see that the two are very similar in design and concept. And they then have the Wraith, which again looks very similar in design and concept. Actually, this Wraith looks like more of a high roller level dungeon Wraith, where it's got a slightly different glow look and feel to it. In their public statements, defendants contend that it was fine for defendants to steal Nexon's selection of assets. I don't believe they actually use the word steal, but again, I digress, because each individual asset is by itself owned by the Unreal Engine marketplace. Defendants' contention is contrary to the Copyright Act, which protects a work formed by the collection and assembling of pre-existing materials or of data that are selected, coordinated, and arranged in such a way that the resulting work as a whole constitutes an original work of authorship. Now, they then go on to say, like, well, notes, musical notes. Also, novels are made from the same 26 letters in the English language. The assembly of them, if someone were to arrange those words exactly as it's written in another book, would be considered plagiarism. Now, that is absolutely true. However, I think the music argument is a little bit more weak, because there are countless numbers of songs that use the same 4-chord progression, ranging from Elvis to Adele. Nexon selected the door below on the left for P3 from the Unreal Engine marketplace, but customized it by making it wider than the stock door, meaning that the one in the pack was modified. Defendants selected exactly the same door that Nexon did for Dark and Darker, and on Information and Belief, widened it in the same manner. So the question is whether or not it's the same by pixels, or whether or not the level design was made in a way where maybe the character model couldn't fit through the doorway and that's why it had to be widened. But again, this is one of those things that they're making claims on. Secondarily, P3 players can sit at campfires to congregate with other players and replenish their health. In Dark and Darker, players rest in front of a campfire in identical sitting positions. Now again, this is one of those things that might be a little bit hard to argue away from. They then go on to talk about how the torch is using the same exact color of lighting that took Nexon months to be able to approve. To me, this doesn't look like it's the exact same color of yellow light. In fact, this one looks like it's a little bit more pale than this one does. This one looks like it's got a little bit more of a warm yellow hue or yellow-orange hue to it, a little bit more gold. In my case, I'm looking at this and I don't see how it's the same. You can't really draw a conclusion on yellow light if you're asking me. And this looks very similar to a number of other games. I mean, the yellow light from the torch in both Rust and in Elder Scrolls looks eerily similar to this. And in prior playtests, they also gave us the ability to use a blue-colored torch, so who knows? They then go on to say that players in P3 opening treasure chests is something that they can do. In most other games, as in real life, that action would consist of reaching for the lid and physically lifting it with your hands. In P3, however, characters move their hands in a distinctive circular motion over the chest without physically touching it. Characters in P3 can bandage their wounds by using a distinctive circular hand motion. As depicted in the snapshots below, defendants copied the same motions in Dark and Darker. Wrapping hand motion is something that's also used in Escape from Tarkov. To me, this looks like the bandage wrapping animation that's being done right here, just in a different kind of way so that people are able to reuse the same animation as the bandage hand wrap to open the chest, and is something that they likely were planning on changing at some point in the future. They then say that there's a stealth animation or a stealth mode that goes into grayscale, with the P3 game being here, and then the Dark and Darker one that causes a little bit more motion blur effect. In both games, the characters have various ways to buff or shield themselves from offensive spells and attacks. One example is the buff bubble, which illustrated in a way is unique to P3. Again, this is not unique. People have been using bubbles for defense since the earliest days of MMOs. People call for bubbles all the time in World of Warcraft. That's got 15 plus years worth of time where you're getting bubbles from disc priests. Now, however, there is an argumentative point to be made here where they talk about the potion being on your belt and that potion lighting up and being visible by other players. Being something that is indicative and unique to Project P3. They then talk about the Tavern Hall and say that the Tavern Hall is a carbon copy, even though it was turned into Gathering Hall. And then they go on to say, in both P3 and Dark and Darker, take place through a similarly structured dungeon basement. In the P3 project, they built a 5-level dungeon that resembles an inverted pyramid structure. On information and belief, this multi-level inverted pyramid structure dungeon is replicated in Dark and Darker. Defendants have announced that the first level of the dungeon will be revealed in the 5th playtest. Now, that is true. They did, but they only ever planned on having 3 levels, not 5. So in this case, I don't believe this to be an argumentative point for them whatsoever, and this one, to me, completely misses the mark. They then talk about there being a form of poison fog that would force people toward a certain section of the dungeon where other players get located. Defendants implemented the same spatial control feature renamed Dark Swarm that forces players to a certain location in the dungeon in Dark and Darker. Forcing PvP through a BR circle is, again, nothing new. This doesn't strike me as anything new or unique. Again, I don't believe this to be an argumentative point, but I do believe Nexon to have points to argue. Now, they then go on to talk about why they're trying to argue this in the Western United States, giving examples as to why they had been heavily marketed in the US. And this is where I get named. Actually, they stated that 38.67% of all Dark and Darker players were from the United States, and that the most popular market was Japan at 7.94%, that they had an ARG event that they used where they used a New York City park bench that my community actually, myself and people in my community actually ended up solving, which was really sweet. But here's where I get named. Park also conducted interviews with YouTube channels targeted to US gamers, including Onepeg on October 2022 and February 2nd, 2023. In English with Pestily on November 24th in 2022, and Jonah Vale Gaming from the United States on February 6, 2023 in English. In these interviews, Park discusses the background of Iron Mace, playtest details about Dark and Darker, and future plans, including new features, early access, cost estimates, etc. To Nexon's knowledge, Park and Iron Mace did not conduct any interviews in Korean or market the game in ways that would have targeted a Korean audience. So this is to illustrate that they believe that there should be something litigated in the United States because it's being heavily pushed to a United States market, basically. And they're also trying to state that because the game is heavily served with Amazon web hosting as well as Steam, that it makes sense for this to be tried in Seattle. Now, what they want. They obviously want Iron Mace to cease and desist, but they also expect that there's going to be damages handed over by Iron Mace to Nexon for having stolen what they did in terms of profitability of their game. Now, wherever they end up coming down on that is completely unknown because Iron Mace hasn't made a penny from it. All they have is potential sales progression and projections. And it's likely that the Q&A that I did would be something that they reference where Sacriel and I ended up saying that they were going to get 2 million units. So, sorry. But they also said that they want them to permanently and preliminarily enjoy defendants, their officers, employees, agents, subsidiaries, representatives, distributed dealers, members, affiliates, internet service providers, and all persons acting in concert or participation with them from misappropriating their stuff, including by copying, marketing, distributing, or publicly performing Dark and Darker or any game substantially similar, requiring them to deliver all copies of materials, requiring them to deliver all copies of materials that infringe or violate plaintiff's rights described herein, anything unlawfully stolen, and monetary relief damages sustained by plaintiff in an amount not yet determined, and disgorgement of defendant's ill-gotten gains, and awarded plaintiff its costs of suit and attorney's fees, and awarding such other further relief as this court may deem just and appropriate. And then the rest of the court filings are defendant's name and address, where they're making court summons for proof of appearance for each one of the people involved, and copies of registrations of copyright for evidentiary reasons. So yeah, that's everything that I've got, guys. It looks as though Nexon is going to keep this thing in court for a real long time. It also looks like they've got a case. I mean, I hate to be the person that's going to like to admit it, but Nexon is claiming that they're trying to get Iron Mace to actually show them source code, and they're saying that Iron Mace is outright refusing to do so. I'm hoping that at some level, Iron Mace will be able to defend all of these positions in a way that satisfies the court. Whether or not they're going to be able to do that, I don't know. What I can say is that in the United States, they stand the best possible chance to win this. as opposed to a court in, say, Korea. The fact that they're actually trying it in the United States is actually a good thing for Iron Mace, believe it or not, because United States courts tend to side with the little guy a little bit more often than they do the big one. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I don't feel super confident about it, but you got to admit, if Iron Mace is trying to carry it this hard, they got some brass balls. And if they think they can win it, more power to them, man. I hope they do. But they got to be able to prove it. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, guys, thanks so much for coming and checking this out. You can catch me live at twitch.tv/onepeg. I'm live every day around 7 to 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until whenever. And as always, if you would consider subbing the channel here, I would very, very much appreciate it. Thank you so much for lending me your eyeballs. And I will see you in the next one. Peace.